Good afternoon, everybody. Do we have energy after lunch? Kind of, some nervous chuckles. So my name is Susan Zachariah. I am the Vice President of OCAMPR, and I have the privilege of introducing both of our paper presenters today. I'll start with one. I'll start with our first one, and then I'll come back up here, and then I'll introduce our next presentation. So, Dr. Stephen John Harris will be reading his paper, The Problem of Gnomic Will, a proposed model for spiritual and psychological development. Dr. Harris is a clinical psychologist who has been in private practice for over 30 years. In addition to receiving his PhD in psychology, he has earned certifications in psychoanalytic and Jungian psychotherapy. He's the former director of the Center for Depth Psychology and co-director of the Psychoanalytic Study Center of Southern California, both in Newport Beach, California. He also was the clinical director for the Center for Individual and Family Therapy of Orange, California. He has also taught at VIOLA, University's Rosemead of Professional Psychology, Vanguard University. He was awarded the Distinguished Professor Award both at the California Graduate Institute and the American Behavioral Studies Institute. And other than numerous articles on faith and psychology, he has published a number of books: God, Psychology and Faith and Dialogue, To Be or Not to Be, Explorations of Madness and Faith, and Despair and Faith, a dialogue between Kierkegaard and patristic thought. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Harris to present his paper today.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for coming to this presentation. There's so many choices and so many things to see. When I think of the title of this, it feels like, it's either you have some kind of nerdy interest in this, or maybe you want to see the presentation after mine, or you're a clergy, or some other interest. But anyway, I appreciate your coming, and this is a bit of an experiment or exploration in an idea about another way of looking at the gnomic will and some of our ways that we respond to each other, and maybe to some extent how our faith is affected. And so yet another typology, if you haven't had enough of the Enneagram and Myers-Briggs and other things, here comes another little typology, but I hope this is of interest to you. Okay, let me get started. So this paper will briefly describe the gnomic will, and then I'll relate it to a model for assisting persons in spiritual guidance and psychotherapy or counseling. So the first Adam, created in the image of God, possessed all the potential for living a divine life before surrendering it, unlike the second Adam, Christ, who was able to maintain his allegiance to the divine. It would be some time after Christ's earthly ministry, death, and resurrections for theologians and the fathers of the church to understand the nature of the image of God through the personhood of Christ. It was considered heresy to affirm only his divinity, but also heresy to regulate him as a mere human, such as a prophet, but not equal to the Father and the Holy Spirit. This theological tightrope not only has great implications for the beliefs of the church, but also carries with it powerful implications for anthropology, if not the theanthropology of humans. Saint Maximus the Confessor would account for both Christ's divinity and his human qualities in his writing, and in so doing defined the gnomic will of humans. So let's say more about the gnomic will, or really two wills. As Adam possessed both a natural or divine will in the garden, living freely in paradise in full communion with God, he also had a natural will in terms of his, also had a human will. And these two wills, when they were opposed in the fall, created a state of potential confusion and a state of mixed allegiances, and ultimately introduced a whole deliberation process for humans, the power of choice. And so Christ also had two wills, human and divine, which were permanently united. And this ideal, whose presentation in absolute humility and sacrifice of love, offered himself to humans to help redeem our will and return us to perfect communion with God. Difficulties arising from the gnomic will is the focus of this work, which will take us into considering spiritual and emotional conditions of people. What can the gnomic will mean for the rest of humanity? The salvific goal of theosis, or uniting the person's will with the divine will, comes as close to a return to paradise as we have. Given the potential confusions that accompany conflicted wills, practicing faith requires both an awareness and the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and without this we become vulnerable to misapplying what we think is the will of God. With limited awareness, one may fail to see the difference between one's own perceptions and desires from divine intentions, or the logoi. Further, mistaking rigid adherence to rules, practice, and the administration of one's articles of faith could miss the entire point by confusing legalism with faith and working in cooperation with God. Similarly, one might apply secular ideas, as we've been talking about throughout this conference, in a way that emotional and spiritual health can be mistaken for salvific ones. In these examples, one's receptiveness to the Holy Spirit and discernment may be limited. So certainly, spiritual practice demands that one work at recognizing the two voices or wills, one divine and the other human. So most certainly we're referring to discernment. Spiritual fathers are experts in the teaching of this difference. From a psychological viewpoint, it seems necessary to inquire into ways our psychological dispositions affect discernment. Psychologically, the ability to engage with internal dialogue in the context of both external and private expressions of faith can be helped by psychological awareness. For example, in a publication in Greece, I was asked to pray alongside a pastoral counselor to write in response to a case of a young man who was instructed to pray quietly by his spiritual father. Obedient to these instructions, his efforts did not seem to be rewarded. Instead, his mind would race and become increasingly unable to concentrate. Ordinarily, this recommended practice aimed at inner peace is helpful. However, because of this tendency towards obsessional thought and intellectualization, as it turns out, he became debilitated by the approach. So somehow, the psychological space required in his mind became foreclosed by his problematic disposition. Other psychological sequelae interfered with the mental space that is required for this practice of prayer. So within just a few sentences, we have begun to inquire into a few of the challenges for which a person to engage psychologically with the gnomic will in mind, considerations for the divine will and the soul. On the spiritual guidance side of the question, the training of the will under the direction of a spiritual father, the adherence to learn to train one's nous to guide their soul into closer relationship with the divine will and towards union with him. This training may also positively affect his or her emotional health. However, as we can see, many obstacles may arise along the way. These include moral resistance and psychological defenses. Each of these threatens to foreclose upon the space in the mind where human and divine wills attempt to meet. A particularly difficult defense, called the false self by Winnicott, is an adaptive accommodation of one's caretaker when the child conforms with a pathological behavior that does not seem to permit for the child's normal psychosomatic response. The solution is to resolve this disparity by conforming with the pathological situation in order to maintain the relationship and avert abandonment. False compliance like this can extend itself into adulthood and must not be confused with obedience. These considerations lead us to some important consideration. A spiritual father generally provides important guidelines for the spiritual path, or ladder, if we can borrow from St. John Climacus, guiding with spiritual disciplines meant to be salvific. The psychotherapist counselor engages in what is often a much more open-ended exploration to promote psychological growth that includes more adaptive behavior and effective ways of managing emotional life and relationships. Emotional difficulties often limit, but can be an asset to the spiritual life, and likewise, spiritual problems can generate emotional problems. I propose that on the psychological side of this equation, there are some important intersections to consider that affect both domains. Although we are often drawn into discussions that involve categorizing healthy versus non-healthy behaviors, or having a more pious orientation, etc., I'm proposing that investigating certain personality dimensions that present themselves both in therapy clients and patients and to spiritual disciples, which can influence how we work together between disciplines. And each affects the unique relationship with whomever we are helping. Further, keeping in mind gnomic willing, it is important to make a distinction between spiritual resistance and disobedience and natural psychological dispositions to face the challenges that relate to both disciplines and therapy clients. To look at this challenge from one level, I'd like to propose what you have on your handout, a proposal of a four-dimensional personality model. So this is not fully worked out or fully validated with factor analyses and all of these things, but some dimensions I felt that I wanted to introduce in terms of this exploration. I'm proposing the model explores the interaction between openness, which has been studied extensively from the research on the Big Five personality test, and another trait that is very familiar to us but has been researched far less, introspection. Introspection, or a probing examination of one's own emotional mental processes, holds considerable value for sober reflection, or nepsis, or the watchfulness of the heart, and conflicts that are found in the nous. The interaction between the two appears to have considerable promise. Any study of these factors should also include their presumed opposites, to be more constricted and or unreflective. For the purposes of this discussion, there are some basic parts of these traits I'd like to try to describe and offer characterizations for each. I tentatively offer the following. Openness could involve features such as creative, trying new things, problem solving, curious, imagination, potentially naive, or gullible. The closed orientation can feel very focused, disliking change, resist new ideas, be less imaginative, dislike abstraction or theoretical ideas, and may be more prone to defensiveness. Although I would argue that we all have defenses. All right, introspective we'll describe briefly as thoughtful, serious, contemplative, pensive, meditative, and perhaps even ruminative or worried, or anxious. Unreflective individuals with this quality tend to be more action-oriented, often willing to take charge, may be flippant, impatient, impulsive, or less focused on inner meanings. So I'm not assigning every one of these features to these categories, but these are some possibilities that fall under the categories. As I mentioned, I wish not to assign positive or negative values to help us with these, but to explore what implications they may have for the spiritual father or psychotherapist counselor's role. Each may have assets and drawbacks and may exhibit themselves in varying degrees and dimensions. Now I'd like to look at these factors as blends of the two, and this is on your handout as well, to look at the further complexity of them. Individuals who may be more inclined to be open and introspective, may be more creative, innovative, curious, contemplative, nonconformist, self-confident, but also self-sufficient, which isn't always an asset, but we'll go into that later. Individuals who are inclined to be closed and introspective may tend to be more narrow and focused on ideas, more ruminative, can be more inclined to be melancholic, introspective, and the quality of their introspection may also be more painful or anxious because of being closed off to other sources of support, input, and ideas. This can result. Lastly, closed and unreflective individuals may tend to be more concrete. Structure is very important. Less insight, fearful, more vulnerable to being overwhelmed. And so you can see that sometimes we value some of these categories more than others, but I really want to highlight that there are a lot of strengths if you look closer in terms of how they play out in our relationships. And let's go ahead and take a look at that further. Another challenge, though, is that many of these combinations may not exhibit themselves consistently over time. Some people may be more closed in some situations and more open in others. And so this is not a nice, tidy categorization. It may change from context to context or mood to mood. And so some of these combinations may be what we call more emotional states, while others may be more consistent over time and be traits in individuals. So having reviewed these categories, I'd like to steer the rest of the discussion towards how these can affect what is called mental space. Mental space has come up, sprinkled out some of the talks throughout this conference. The space to process things, the space to reflect, and the space to pray and give space to God, and have a mental space that allows for some of those processes to happen. I'm going to define it here briefly as a dialectical process between the person and the object or the other, the self and other, the object and a symbol, and additionally, for our purposes, the self and God. The provision of mental space allows for learning, tolerance of dialogue, ability to see from multiple perspectives, and so on. And since I've been told we have a little more time, I'm going to go off a little bit on that part, because this is really important. Even though we may value one of these types more than the other, we can really benefit. Somebody who's more exploratory and inventive can really also be benefited from people who play by the rules and hold our feet to the ground. And so this is what I have in mind when I say well, I'm going to save that little punchline for later, but what I have in mind in terms of how we work together. So, and we might say that our great teacher, Jesus Christ, operated this way when he could teach with parables that would make us think at different levels, widening our vision. For example, what you've done unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me, and getting us to think at different levels about ourselves and our world and God. While it can be helpful to have the capacity to have mental space, it can also be quite helpful to realize that when it is not possible, this capacity will be foreclosed upon and can be useful to determine when persons are negating each other. And it also seems important that in loving others or missing love, also too much mental space can be overwhelming, and too much exploration can too. And a strict, clear orientation can be required. I'm thinking when I read that now of the theory of Melanie Klein. I'm not a Kleinian, but later writers who talked about her depressive position and paranoid schizoid position. The paranoid schizoid person shuts down experience, and the depressive person begins to compromise and, give into reality and work with relationships and acknowledge how much we need each other, is one way to think about it. Well, modern Kleinians, neo-Kleinians as they call them, have pointed out that sometimes a constricted, almost, if you will, legalistic or rule-oriented structure is needed. And so it can be a corrective factor, not just one's healthy and the other is not. Okay. So, mental space, some implications for spiritual and psychological development. For brevity, I shall provide a few examples to illustrate their potential utility. For example, with the open introspective type, there may be a risk at self-sufficiency and vulnerability to the passion of pride. This can result from having more resources for, quote unquote, figuring things out and overlooking the need for others. Obviously, this can be a liability for the community, the individual, and faith. The limitations may be a vulnerability to what I guess I'll call it lacking relational space. I can't remember if I put that in the handout or not, but these individuals can be helped by seeing the multitude of ways they need others, and on the other hand, these individuals can be visionaries for their communities and are capable of quality relationships. For closed introspective presentations, the drawback can be not allowing new information that can help growth, often driven by a need for protection, a different kind of limitation, owing to being aware of many things, but also cutting themselves off at the pass, so to speak. And so I propose that they narrow their scope of experience too much and seem vulnerable to melancholy and despair. Also, because of the emotional deprivation and the support that they lack, they can be robbed of the fulfillment that comes from the enrichment of relationships. These may drain their energy as a result. I just said this, excuse me. And so what they may lack is, in terms of this idea of mental space, is experiential space. They can be quite aware of the meanings of their faith. They can be psychologically insightful, but they need to expand their awareness into areas that limit their ability to learn from new perspectives and let more information in. Things for them can feel already resolved or said and done, and ranging from self-righteous rigidity to keepers of the flame in the tradition, they can also be very insightful and humble as a presence in our world. Now, for the open, unreflective style, these individuals may possess something closest to the qualities of the extrovert, seeing new vistas and willing to take charge, and often confident and willing to act. These individuals tend to be more content and enjoy when they can inspire and help. Their vulnerability can be a lack of foresight into the implication of their decisions. They want to care and mean to, but can miss on the idea that what is good for the goose is not always good for the gander. They may miss that one of the needs of saving others could include saving themselves. And so it can be really important for them to learn through their premature actions that they shut down interior mental space, being reflective about their actions. They may be enriched by learning to understand psychological projection. However, they should not be discouraged from their ways of helping, but rather helped by the meanings they strive to hold for themselves. Often natural leaders learning more awareness can strengthen their growth and service. Those who we observe to be closed and unreflective type can almost feel like, well, this is, I don't know, a more negatively tinged sounding person. They can seem to be the most concrete, fearful, grim, and rigid because of their apparent lack of mental space and resources to manage their lives. They carefully manage with adherence to structure and can seem very legalistic, following the letter of the law. We can see that they appear to close the door and therefore can constrict mental space as well. When engaged in a community, they can be counted on to be the most reliable. So this is another positive trait to be thinking about. They are vulnerable to having difficulties grasping symbolic meanings or the point of views of others, while they may be easily overwhelmed by complexity or ambiguity. It is helpful for them to have spiritual fathers or therapists whom they trust to help them point towards growth and exploration. We might say, help with carrying the mental and spiritual space for them on the way to finding their own mental space. The potential for complementary collaborations seems most relevant here, especially with mutual respect that can be cultivated. A spiritual father who has his characteristic style of relating may be an asset with this kind of individual. In conclusion, keeping in mind the gnomic will, in this brief model, I've introduced a little bit further complexity about different kinds of types and their interactions, with less emphasis on how they interact for spiritual and psychological development, and how these types affect an important ingredient, mental space. The effort to bring about the alignment of human to divine will seems to involve discernment at various levels of spiritual and psychological awareness on our way to a healthier dependence on each other and God. If we consider their application, what might we gain from being mindful of these styles of relating? Can we be more helpful to each other and more realistic about our individual dispositions? Perhaps rather than our tendency to think of mental health as addressing behavior or problems at the fringes, could mental health involve finding ways to help us think about our differences along the way to our common allegiances and faith? Our efforts may be enhanced through our growing awareness of the one and the many and the various parts of the body of Christ, which operate differently but also unite to coordinate their efforts to serve the one body. Each person contributes their part to the whole. Thus, we all need each other in the body of Christ. This typology is a product of observation and speculation. However, these qualities and different types have not been subjected, as I said earlier, to validation and factor analysis. Future research to evaluate these and other variables might help us further along the way with this model. Thank you.
Yeah, we have. Just make an announcement. So we have about 10 minutes for question and answer before we move on to the next paper proposal. So you all know the drill. We've got a mic there. Feel free to come up, share comments as well as questions you might have.
Thank you.
I'm wondering how might holding space look in the different types that you've described? What does that appear in those different kind of types?
Okay, just going down for the... I think just prescriptively starting from closed and unreflective, it can be very important to make incremental change at trying out new behaviors, be a little experimental, to try something I think this happens in therapy all the time, and I suspect we see it in spiritual direction too, where we're asked to do something different and expose ourselves and to see what happens. And so sometimes there's fears with that personality type, and so conducting little incremental changes and experiments to see how they come out. So that's the one type. Am I moving okay into what you're asking about? Okay. I pull my list back up. Make sure I grab those. For the open but unreflective type, which I think that's probably the one I gave the most sort of prescriptive in terms of learning about projection and learning the person who's a little bit more extroverted and action-oriented but is less reflective, to help them become more aware of what motivates what they do, can go a long way to cultivating more mental space. In the closed introspective type, this is an overgeneralization, but very often, as I encounter it, these individuals are a little less comfortable with connection and allowing more input or feedback about themselves from others in relationships. And so there's probably other avenues, but I'm going to stay with that one for now in terms of being open to different points of input. Often, if there's a defensiveness around the sort of closed orientation, a Socratic style of questioning the value of what they're doing and how it's what happens when they don't connect with others and don't get feedback, and try to open up avenues of mental space through further inquiry. For the open introspective, I think what's important, this is kind of, I implied this a few minutes ago about sort of helping them keep their feet on the ground, help them see the limitations of doing it all themselves. So yeah, I'll stop right there on that one. There's some more that I could say. There's some other questions. Okay, thank you. Good question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris, for this. I guess those four combinations of types, each of them presents different adventures of the gnomic will. So if a further elaboration of what's going on with the gnomic will in each of the four is explored, then it might be your next book, and it's quite fruitful. I may have a question on the mental space, which I think I have captured what you mean by that, but I would like to ask, how much is it conscious? Is it exclusively conscious? I mean, we can better understand what mental space is when it is conscious, but sometimes we come upon people who have a very a high sense of a spiritual gnomic will aligned with the will of God.
Yes.
And they respond to that, and they avoid sins, and they struggle for virtues, but without so much conscious elaboration. Mm-hmm. So what about their mental space? Can we still call it mental space if it's predominantly unconscious or not?
Yeah, sure. This, of course, at least in my mind, is a very important, very good question, and very complicated. I think I'll start answering it. I don't think I'll finish answering it. But I think even in people who consider themselves more psychologically aware, we've become aware that our minds, consciousness, is just about the last to know. We might feel something first in our body. We may ask ourselves, why are we uncomfortable? We may even have some physiological signs of anxiety and so forth. But, we're already becoming aware of something. And of course, if we're going to think about what it is, there is mental space created. But this is a good question because I don't know if that's another category, because spiritual, as we know, spiritual disciplines greatly can influence someone's spiritual health, emotional health. And so, do they have to be aware of what's going on psychologically? I'm not so sure. But I think the aim of this in thinking of gnomic will is that we're trying to end back up to be more united with God. And, is there an argument everyone should go to psychotherapy? I don't think it's necessarily true. So it's, I'll have to think about that more. So I definitely feel like when I try to speak about something or teach something, I'm also the student and the learner. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. I was thinking about these comparisons in the context of marriage therapy, and wondering if you thought about that, have come across that. Are you working on something? Because about 1/3 of my caseload are couples. And I like the way you categorize these things, but I can see that it would help also Orthodox therapists who do marriage therapy to bring this to light for the couple as well. Have you thought about that?
Yeah. I don't know if I can formally say I thought about that, but what comes to mind, it makes me think when you say that about marital cases and how I've worked. And I think that's where the phrase I briefly alluded to, relational space, in terms of two people, in a sense, if we think about types like this and different ways of approaching their faith, and then they collide and have different ways of, there's just a load of research that the reasons people divorce or the marriage doesn't last is two people look at the same problem from a completely different viewpoint. And the more different it is, the more difficult it is, of course, to rectify that. But I do think it's helpful if we're able to, in marital therapy, to it's almost like helping them become bilingual in terms of their language of experience, their ways that they see things, and try to teach a culture of a little more tolerance of that. Even, I think I hear myself say, when I'm in a process of seeing very many couples, I can't tell you how many times I say, can you listen and repeat back what they're saying? That doesn't mean you're agreeing with them, but can you restate and communicate your understanding of what's being said without necessarily agreeing, so that it becomes part of the process of further dialogue and understanding. So I've also felt that a self-psychological approach to marital therapy